Well, hello, and thank you for joining the Rosewood Institute's second webinar series. And today we're going to be discussing when it really is about the food, nutritional issues for eating disorders. And I'll be introducing Megan Niskern, registered dietitian for the Rosewood Centers for Eating Disorders. And my name is Libby Neal, and I'm the executive director of training and education. And you will see a contact for me at the end of the presentation. And please do send along questions, or if you'd like for me to forward the slides to you, I'm more than happy to follow up with anything that you request. And on that note, I would like to introduce Megan Niskern, Executive Director of Nutrition Services for Rosewood Centers for Eating Disorders and registered dietitian.
Thank you, Libby, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm so excited to be a part of this webinar, and like Libby said, please send in any questions you have, and hopefully we'll be able to get to those at the end. So first of all, a little outline. Today we're going to be addressing specifically professionals who are looking for a foundation to work with the dietitian and with the eating disorder client. We're going to provide you with an understanding of the complete nutritional assessment and how that sets the stage for a long-term treatment of an eating disorder. We're also going to talk a little bit about how to work with the treatment team and separating topics that the dietitian covers in treatment versus topics that the clinical team is a little bit more responsible for. So I know that you're probably all pretty familiar with the following diagnoses, but I just wanted to review really briefly what it is I'm going to be referring to today when I say the word eating disorder. First of all, we have anorexia nervosa. There's a restricting and a purging type. Anorexia nervosa and then bulimia nervosa, restricting and purging type, are both pretty specific diagnoses. We have eating disorder NOS, non-specified, and this is when someone has some different tendencies that may fall under anorexia and maybe even a little bit of the bulimia, but it's not as specific as those two diagnoses. Next, we have binge eating disorder, which is a newer term in the diagnosis of eating disorder. And this is the overeating, the binge eating, the obesity that plays a role with disordered eating. And then we have a disordered eating pattern, which is kind of a more generic term. It talks about someone who has eating disordered tendencies, but again, maybe not to the extreme as some of these other diagnoses. And we'll get into some of those terms and those details a little bit further on in the presentation today. So I wanted to take a few moments to talk a little bit about malnutrition and eating disorder treatment and just give a brief overview of what the term malnutrition means. Malnutrition is not the same thing as hunger, although they can often go together, specifically when you're dealing with an eating disorder client. People who are chronically malnourished lack the nutrients needed for proper health and development, again, which we often see in eating disorder clients. And someone can be considered malnourished, either for a long or short period of time. Their condition can be mild or severe, but it really does not have to be specific in one way or another for them to be considered malnourished. A little bit further into some details of the effects of malnutrition and how it relates to the eating disorder client. Some examples are listed here, some of the more extreme and severe examples that we do see in eating disorder clients. For example, fatigue, loss of muscle tone, reduced sensation, weight loss, and in children, slow growth, pale skin, hair loss, brittle or constant bone health issues, nails, dental problems, scaly skin, mouth sore, slow wound healing, frequent infections, poor immune function, kidney and heart problems, difficulty breathing, dehydration, as you can see, quite an extensive list of things that can fall under the term malnutrition. And many of these symptoms we do see in our eating disorder clients. It's important to note that these broad effects are oftentimes treated as medical conditions instead of being seen as one whole example of an eating disorder behavior client. So it'll take time distracting with all of these other medical conditions instead of really getting to the underlying issues, which is that base eating disorder behavior. And if untreated, malnutrition can result in death. It can be pretty extreme. So some of the goals that the dietitian has when working with an eating disorder client, first of all, there's the challenges of building rapport and trust with someone who can be cognitively impaired from the malnourishment, the things that we talked about previously, and also who are just not trusting the process or not trusting someone new that they're going to be sharing a lot of their their intimate details with and making changes in how it is that they feed themselves. We do a complete assessment, and that assessment gives us a lot of information, and we're going to go into in some detail today. We discuss short and long-term recovery goals based on that assessment, and this really helps the dietitian and the client to have an idea of what some of the future-directed recovery things are going to look like so that everybody's on the same page and the client can anticipate continued changes. We also create options for food routines, intakes, and rituals. We're looking to make small changes over periods of time that really put them in the role of a recovery mindset. We teach the clients how to work with the dietitians, including continual nutrition education to deal with food myths. So part of being a dietitian is educating the client about what it is they believe is going on, such as, I can't eat carbohydrates, and why it is that that's untrue. We also want to make sure we're balancing support for the small successes the client has with goal-directed nutrition challenges, such as they have purging all week, but it's important to identify they increase their water intake. So making sure you're identifying those small successes. So I really want to take some time to go through what a dietary initial nutrition assessment entails and why it's so important. I want to point out that this applies to all levels of care, whether you're working with an eating disorder patient at the outpatient level of care, inpatient, a partial level. It's really important to obtain as much information with this initial nutrition assessment as you can. And to make sure you have plenty of time, we recommend about 1 hour's time for your first session with a new client. And this allows you to take down all of the info and really allows you and the client to get into a lot of detail about all of these different topics we're going to go through. So the first thing that we do with a nutritional assessment is we ask the reasons that the client is seeking treatment today. Why are you here? And we really assess the motivation to change and to find recovery. If they give an example of, my husband said he's going to leave me if I don't get treatment, they may not see the detriment of their eating disorder behaviors or kind of be willing to make some of those changes. However, if someone says that they identify that it's ruining their lives, they can't go to school, they're failing out of classes, causing financial ruin, all of those types of things, they may be a little bit more willing to make some change and really see how the eating disorder is impacting them. Next, we go through a weight history of the client and immediate family. We're really looking for that genetic body component here. We're looking to see what body type exists within the immediate family. So specifically, we're asking about mom, dad, and siblings. We'll ask about eating patterns of their immediate family members and even body types. And oftentimes, they'll be pretty candid here, and they'll have lots of different stories that they may want to share about mealtime in their home or different eating patterns of their mother or father, diets that they've been on, if they're overlooked, those types of things. They're generally pretty honest about this. And then we'll go into family support, who is involved as they go on the journey of recovery and treatment. People who are positive or negative influences matter. It's good to know both. And this is going to play a role later on down the road of recovery, and we'll talk about family support. We talk about any kind of diet history. If they've been kind of a formal diet, more specifically, like the Atkins low-carb diet, if they've been Weight Watcher, any Craig, or if they've even done something like the grapefruit diet, the cabbage soup diet, those types of things. We want to see how many of these things they've tried, and then we also want to find out how successful they were. So how long they did this, and then how much weight change they saw. And the idea here is not that any one of these things necessarily works and we're going to use it in order to create a meal plan or a recovery plan. However, it's really good information to refer back to later on down the road when they're starting to get frustrated with the slow progress they're making and they're wanting some sort of a quick fix. You can really refer back to all of these diets that they have done and how they were not successful to hopefully motivate them to continue on the meal plan or recovery path you've laid out for them. Next, we'll go a little bit into some of the medical stuff that may be going on with them. We'll start with asking any supplements that they take. This includes vitamins, minerals, herbal supplements, anything that they're taking. Sometimes they can be taking an excessive amount of these things, and it may even be causing some sort of harm. A lot of herbs and supplements, when taken together, can have contraindicated results, so you want to make sure you're getting them off of some of those. And then we'll ask about medications. Now, my dietary staff isn't generally responsible for medications, nor does that play a large role in what we do. It's a great cross-check or double-check of what information the patient is or the client is giving out. So For instance, if you're working with a physician or a psychiatrist or even the therapist, you can double check that the client is reporting the same medications to everyone so that everyone's on the same page and there's no abuse there. Next, we'll talk about hospitalizations, surgeries, and pregnancies they've had, and even if it's a non-ED related, non-eating disorder related hospitalization or surgery, it's important to get that information. It may come into play later on down the road, specifically if they're doing any kind of therapy work. Sometimes some of these events can have a high trauma rate, or it can be significant to a trauma that they've had in their past that may have been an underlying issue for their eating disorder. So just obtaining that information can be helpful for the whole treatment team maybe later on down the road. It's important to ask about any current medical or physical concerns. So this would include getting some current lab work. It would include asking about any kind of dizziness or fainting, if they see black spots when they stand, or if they sit up too fast, if they have dehydration. This can even go into hair loss, all kinds of things that they may not have thought of. Any teeth decay or teeth pain, mouth pain. So you really want to go into these extensively, and that can play to that malnourishment piece that we talked about earlier. We also want to detail any of the ED behaviors in as much detail as possible. So an evaluation of all of the behaviors you can think of, from gum chewing to caffeine intake to binging and purging behaviors to laxatives, diuretic abuse, exercise, and frequency. So we'll not only ask how often these behaviors take place in a given day or in a given week, but we'll also ask when these behaviors started. And you can kind of see a trend, and they may have started with something such as diet pills a few years back, and they haven't done diet pills in many, many years. But you want to be on the lookout that they don't return to using diet pills as they start to maybe reduce some other behaviors, like not restricting quite as much. You want to really make sure that you have a full assessment of any past behaviors going on. We do an extensive food recall, which can be difficult for some of the clients. We ask them to give us an example of one good day, which would be a day with minimal or no eating disorder behaviors, and then to go through a typical day, which would be a day full of eating disorder behaviors. We want them to completely detail a full binge, so we have an idea of what a binge means to them and what that looks like. It also includes any kind of a fluid intake for the day. Oftentimes they're restrictive or an overload of fluids, so we ask about water, sodas, caffeinated beverages, those types of things. They can also use fluids as a form of purging. So you're really trying to get an assessment of everything that they're intaking. And it can be difficult, depending on where they are cognitively, for them to recall this, so just be patient, give them some time to really think about a day so you have an accurate assessment. Continue on with the initial nutrition assessment, we next would move into some food allergies. Usually with food allergies, we'll have them self-report, but then we'll also ask for medical documentation, which if they've had any kind of testing done with an allergist, a doctor, a dermatologist, anything like that, shouldn't be difficult to obtain. We also ask about any food intolerances. Right now, gluten and lactose are commonly used as an excuse to be restrictive of grains and dairy foods. So with both of those, we're really looking for an accountability to see what's true and what's eating disorder motivated. We'll also ask them about true dislikes. Everyone has foods that they don't enjoy, so we'll really want to make sure that they're able to identify true dislikes and foods that they don't enjoy versus something that would just be a food fear, a fear within their eating disorder of eating that food. We'll ask about if they're vegan or vegetarian. We'll ask how long, what their motivation for becoming vegan or vegetarian was. Vegans, we oftentimes will encourage to become vegetarian in order to really resolve any malnourishment issues like we had discussed earlier. We'll ask about the use of non-foods. Depending on the depletion of their nutritional state, there is something called pica, in which people will go to dirt or paper, clay or chalk, non-food items, in order to really get a physiological need for some sort of vitamin or a mineral. We'll ask about artificial sweetener use and any kind of odd food combinations. We'll then go into how the eating disorder has affected their relationships, how it's affected work or school, overall functioning on a day-to-day basis, if they're sleeping excessively, if they're isolating, those types of things. And then here are listed four different terms of the disordered eating that I had referred to at the beginning. So these aren't necessarily considered medical terms, but they are acknowledged eating disorder terms. The first is orthorexia, and this is really an obsession with being healthy. Someone who's orthorexic will have a tendency to eat organic food or only natural foods, maybe grass-fed meats only. They would struggle to go out to restaurants because restaurants won't be able to accommodate what it is they allow themselves to have. And they may have an excessive exercise pattern as well. The next is diabulimia, which medically speaking can be very, very dangerous. This is someone who manipulates their insulin levels in order to manage their weight, and it allows their blood sugar levels to be out of control to detrimental levels sometimes. Next is bratorexia, kind of self-explanatory. This is someone who knows that they're going to be getting married, having a big party, and they decide to go on a pretty severe crash diet in order to get as thin or to look as good as they possibly can before the big event. And finally, there's dronchorexia. This is something that's a little bit more related to college students, and it can be a few different ways of manipulating calories and intake. Some people will restrict calories all throughout the day in order to allow those calories to be used for alcoholic beverages in the evening. Or someone may allow them to binge drink throughout the evening, getting to the point where they'll either self-induce purging, or they won't have to self-induce and they'll just purge, and then that can even lead to allowing themselves to binge on foods that they may be considered bad, or binge foods, that kind of a thing, late at night. And then the final piece of the nutrition assessment, the initial nutrition assessment, is a height and weight evaluation. And we take height and weight in order to calculate BMI and a few other things, and then from there we assess meal plan needs. The height and weight are not the only things that are taken into consideration when assessing for meal plan needs. We're taking all of this information we've discussed previously into consideration. We do always do a blind weight, and when it comes to telling the patient of weight changes, we wait until there's a significant concern or significant weight change that may not even reflect what it is the patient or the client is referring to in their recalls. And our meal plans are always based on an exchange and portion system in order to avoid any kind of calorie counting or label reading. So full nutrition assessment is taken into consideration when calculating meal plan needs. And our meal plans consist of 3 meals and 3 snacks every day, and that's to just continue to have that constant nutrition. So some of the nutrition goals for the eating disorder clients include continued weight restoration or refeeding, or even a weight loss through continued food challenges and varieties, depending on the diagnosis. We want to make sure that we're decreasing eating disorder behaviors. And this also includes constantly assessing treatment needs and the changes that may happen. They may need to go to a higher level of care if eating disorder behaviors are not decreasing. They also may need to step down if their eating disorder behaviors are decreasing. We want to make sure we're getting accurate food tracking. One of the great ways to do this is to ask them to track their weekly intake. There's lots of different ways this can be done. It can be very, very detailed, where they're tracking every single thing they eat, or it can be something that's a little bit more generic, with just tracking exchanges each day, bringing in and reviewing that at their weekly dietary sessions. We also want to make sure that we're doing weekly food and nutrition challenges. It's recommended about 3 goals are set each week. And depending on where the client is in their recovery, these goals can be something as extensive as a specific meal outing to a specific restaurant where they order a specific challenging meal, or something as simple as making sure that they're increasing water, decreasing their caffeine, those types of things. Meet the client where it is you see that they're at right now. We want to make sure that we're increasing family support. We always want to increase family to be a part of this process and even to come to sessions. Oftentimes the family won't sit in for the full session. They want to make sure you're giving the client the time that they need to talk about their issues, but maybe taking 5 or 10 minutes of the session to educate any family members or supportive friends on what it is that's going on with their loved one and the eating disorder, and also how they can be best supportive. So they can be a positive support instead of a negative support. Always want to acknowledge victories along the way, no matter how small. And that's not only going to continue to encourage your eating disorder client, but it's also going to continue to build that trust and that rapport that's going to really help them along their way in this process. Finally, we have some observations for the clinical team. There's lots of things that are observed in dietary sessions but don't necessarily fall under our area of expertise, but we can take this information in and then bring it back to the treatment team or the necessary professional who would be dealing with that as great information. So one of the things you can look for is different clothing or same clothing, how someone's taking care of themselves, their hygiene. Look at any kind of a dramatic weight loss or weight gain within a week. 3 pounds is considered a pretty dramatic weight change for a week. Looking at any puffiness in the face or stomach, and again, this is just observed, but this can definitely indicate any kind of a purging or a binging behavior. And sometimes if your client isn't reporting that those behaviors are going on, this may indicate that they're struggling with being honest about where they're at. Any kind of isolating behaviors that are being reported, if they're not hanging out with friends or family, if they're sleeping excessively, any kind of self-harm behavior, any cross addictions or behaviors that they're doing outside of the eating disorder would include alcohol, drugs, excessive sexual behaviors, those types of things. Any impulsive changes in their appearance or lifestyle, and having a conversation with someone, lots of different things will come up, and so sometimes these impulsive changes can be reported in a dietary session. Any radical emotional fluctuations. Someone comes in one week and everything is great and life is wonderful and they're doing as well as they can possibly be doing. Next week they're hysterically crying, they can't pull it together, they can't form a sentence. And then the following week they're back to being happy, everything's great. So just look for any kind of emotional fluctuations that may seem out of character for that particular client. And then any change in behaviors, maybe they start to chew gum excessively or they're water loading in order to manipulate their weight, excessive shopping behaviors, anything along those lines that seems a little bit out of character or a change in what it is that they normally do is excellent information to observe and then to bring back to the treatment team so that everyone continues to be on the same page. So as we've reviewed today, dietary's role in the treatment of eating disorders is to obtain some detailed nutrition, medical, and eating disorder behavior information, but it's also our role to observe and build trust so that we ensure long-term recovery and treatment, building that rapport. It is also essential to stay in communication with all of the professionals and to make sure that we're sharing info with those professionals so that everyone can stay on the same page in order to get that person the recovery that they want. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Lee right now and go through some questions.
Great, Megan, thank you. That wonderful overview of the recovery process and how it relates to the nutrition aspect for a person with an eating disorder. And I'm going to just try and get through as many questions as we can with the time we have left. And if you don't get your question answered, please do write me, and you'll see on the screen right now both of our email addresses, and I will be sure and get a response from you for you. Megan, one of the questions is, how come it's important for a person who's trying to move into recovery from an eating disorder to eat 6 times per day?
Well, it's really important to get that nutrition in them and to their body and their metabolism to start trusting them again. Oftentimes, someone who has an eating disorder, whether it's an anorexia or a binge, is that they're doing things in very restrictive fashions or in an overloading fashion. And so the body starts to shut down systems because it doesn't trust it's going to get that continual fuel source. So by feeding someone 6 times a day, you're really retraining the body and the metabolism that they're not going to be in kind of one of those extreme states. It's also really important because hunger fullness cues can be a big trigger when it comes to wanting to binge or wanting to purge. So by spreading food out throughout the day, you're never going to be in an extreme hunger or an extreme fullness state that may really trigger those strong urges to purge or to binge.
Great, thank you. Here's an interesting question. Through weight restoration, does that always prove that malnutrition is going away?
No, it doesn't necessarily prove it. One of the tricky things about malnourishment or being malnourished is that there aren't always specific markers that you can look at in order to assess if those things have been resolved. And yes, there are some lab values that you obtain and that kind of a thing, but there isn't always a guarantee. Also, some things are going to take a lot of time. For instance, in order to rebuild muscle mass or to improve bone health, those aren't going to happen over a couple of weeks or even a couple of months. So, you know, the weight restoration, yes, it's going to play a really big piece in making sure that some of those things begin to be resolved, but it's not going to be immediate.
Great. And the next question is, what do I do? I guess this is for therapists. What do I do if somebody is in my office during a therapy session and all they want to do is talk about their meal plan or what their dietitian did or didn't do for them?
That's a great question. So oftentimes with an eating disorder client, I'll be looking for someone to give them the answer that they want to hear, not necessarily the answer that's best for them. And so oftentimes they may be really frustrated with their dietitian. We tend to challenge them the most to make changes, and that can be really difficult for them to take on. And so they may want to go into your session and get a different answer. Please tell me I don't have to listen to the dietitian, or I don't have to do this, or I don't have to do that. My recommendation is always to refer back to the dietitian. Give them some time to talk a little bit about their frustrations and then really encourage them to speak those frustrations or those concerns to their dietitian. This will avoid any kind of staff splitting. There also isn't really the appropriate time for them to be talking about dietary. You want to use those therapy sessions to make sure that they're working on the underlying issues of their eating disorder and spend time on dietary stuff with the dietitian. It's also a great idea to send a quick email or a quick phone call to the dietitian and just let them know that these concerns are coming up, because oftentimes a client won't go back to the dietitian and let them know. And if that's the case, the dietitian can bring it up in session, so you can really they can have a candid conversation about it.
Great, thank you. And I think the last question that we can get to is, can you say more about what a food myth is?
Yes. So a food myth is a belief that they have about food or how their body functions that's created by their eating disorder or by some sort of behaviors that they've observed in their family of origin, growing up, those types of things that aren't true. So for instance, the fear that if I eat fat, I will therefore become fat. Eating fat does not therefore create fat stores in the body. Educating them on how fat is used in the body, why fat is essential, helps to break down that food myth. There's people that believe that you can't eat after a certain time at night because if you eat after, let's say, 6 or 7 o'clock, your body's going to store all of those calories because your metabolism shuts down when you sleep. So you educate about how the body never shuts down. You actually need energy in order to memories and other functions while you're sleeping. So a food myth can be very, 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 very specific or very broad. And what it does is you're going to look for the food myth in every single person and the food myths that they have, and you want to re-educate them so that they're not holding on to those beliefs.
Great, and it looks like time for one more. And this question is, as my client moves through the different levels of care for the recovery process of an eating disorder, should there be different food expectations for the patient at an inpatient setting versus an outpatient setting?
Oh, great question. There are different expectations to a certain degree. With both outpatient and inpatient settings, there may changes gradually. However, at an inpatient setting, due to the fact that there's a lot more support and a lot more of a control around what's being done, food changes can be made more quickly, but still at a steady, gradual change than they can at outpatient. The other challenge with outpatient is you're only seeing them maybe once a week, and you want to make sure that you're not pushing them so hard that they're not willing to return. So you want to be making changes every single week and make them steady, but you don't want to push so hard that somebody may refuse to come back or may be overwhelmed by the process. At inpatient, like I said, there's a little bit more support, and you can push a little bit harder, a little bit faster because of the additional supports that are around them.
Okay. That looks like all the time that we have. And Megan, I just want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. And again, if you guys see the final slide that you're looking at right now, you have both our contact numbers and emails. And please do send along any questions, or if you'd like for me to forward the slides, I'm more than happy to do that. And check the Rosewood Institute website for future webinar schedules and titles and abstracts. And look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Libby.